The Wyoming wind howled through the wooden buildings of Pine Ridge like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter night. Snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, blanketing the frontier town in a suffocating white shroud that seemed to muffle even the loudest voices. But nothing could silence the angry mob that had gathered in the town square, their torches flickering like demons' eyes in the gray twilight. Elena Castillo stood on the makeshift gallows, her hands bound behind her back, dark hair whipping around her face in the bitter wind. The rough hemp rope scratched against her neck as Sheriff William Brooks adjusted the noose with practiced precision. Her green eyes, usually so full of life and determination, now reflected a mixture of defiance and barely contained terror. "Any last words, murderer?" Brooks sneered, his thick mustache glistening with ice crystals. The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with bloodlust and righteous fury. They wanted justice for Thomas Whitmore, the banker who'd been found dead in his office 3 nights ago, and they wanted it now. Elena lifted her chin, meeting the sheriff's cold gaze. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square despite the wind. "And someday, you'll all know the truth." Brooks' hand moved toward the lever that would open the trapdoor beneath her feet. "Time's up, lady." The crowd held its collective breath. Elena closed her eyes, thinking of all the patients she'd helped as a traveling nurse, all the good she'd tried to do in this harsh, unforgiving land. She thought of her parents, dead from fever when she was barely 16, and how she'd survived alone ever since. At least the cold would soon be over. "Hold it right there." The voice cut through the wind like a blade. Every head turned toward the edge of the square, where a tall figure on horseback emerged from the swirling snow. Jacob Sterling sat atop his black stallion, his buffalo coat making him look like some mythical creature born from the storm itself. Ice hung from his beard, and his blue eyes blazed with an intensity that made even the sheriff take a step back. "This woman deserves a fair trial," Jacob called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd seen real battles and real death. Not a lynching in the middle of a blizzard. Sheriff Brooks recovered his composure, his hand still on the lever. "This is none of your concern, Sterling. Justice is being served here tonight." "Justice?" Jacob dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached the gallows. "You call this justice? Hanging a woman based on nothing but circumstantial evidence?" He gestured toward Elena, who was staring at him with a mixture of hope and confusion. "I've been watching from the hills, Brooks. I saw everything." The crowd began to murmur, some uncertainty creeping into their angry voices. Jacob Sterling was known as a man of his word, a former soldier who'd lost everything but his honor. If he said he'd seen something, "You're lying," Brooks snarled. But there was a tremor in his voice now. "Everyone knows you've been holed up in that ranch of yours like a hermit." Jacob's hand moved to rest on the butt of his Colt revolver. "Maybe it's time I came out of retirement." His eyes swept across the crowd, taking in each face. "I saw someone leaving Whitmore's office that night. Someone in a sheriff's coat." The tension in the square became electric. Elena felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it over the wind. Brooks's face had gone pale beneath his mustache, and his deputy, a thin man called Scar Murphy, was slowly reaching for his gun. "That's a serious accusation, Sterling," Brooks said carefully. "One you can't prove." "Can't I?" Jacob took another step forward. The crowd was backing away now, sensing that this was about to become something far deadlier than a simple hanging. "Funny thing about snow, Sheriff. It holds tracks real well, especially when those tracks lead from the bank to your office and then to the stable where you keep your horse." Elena saw her chance. With the crowd distracted and Brooks focused on Jacob, she began working at the ropes binding her wrists. Her fingers were numb from the cold, but desperation gave her strength. "You're playing a dangerous game," Brooks warned, his hand now hovering over his gun. "These people want justice for Thomas Whitmore. They want the real killer," Jacob corrected. "Not some innocent woman you're trying to frame." Murphy finally drew his weapon, but Jacob was faster. The Colt appeared in his hand like magic, trained directly on the deputy's chest. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Scar." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Elena worked frantically at her bonds, feeling them finally begin to give way. The crowd was shouting now, some calling for the hanging to continue, others demanding to know what Jacob had really seen. Then Murphy made his move. He swung his gun toward Elena, figuring he could eliminate the witness and blame it on Jacob. But he hadn't counted on Elena's resourcefulness. With her hands finally free, she threw herself sideways just as Murphy fired, the bullet splintering the wooden post where her head had been moments before. Jacob's return shot took Murphy in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. The crowd scattered, screaming and running for cover as chaos erupted in the town square. "The rope!" Elena shouted, her hands clawing at the noose around her neck. Brooks was reaching for his gun now, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Jacob didn't hesitate. His knife flashed silver in the torchlight as he leaped onto the gallows platform. The blade sliced through the hemp just as Brooks pulled the lever. Elena dropped, but instead of falling to her death, she collapsed onto the platform, gasping and alive. "Run!" Jacob grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "My horse is at the edge of town." They leaped from the gallows together, landing hard in the snow. Brooks was shouting orders, trying to rally what was left of the mob, but the storm was getting worse, and most of the townspeople had already fled to the safety of their homes. Elena stumbled, her legs weak from fear and cold, but Jacob's strong arm kept her upright. They fought their way through the drifting snow, toward where his stallion waited, the animal's dark coat almost invisible in the blizzard. "Why?" Elena gasped, as Jacob boosted her into the saddle. "Why are you helping me?" Jacob swung up behind her, his arms coming around her as he took the reins. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he said simply, "and because I've seen enough innocent people die." Behind them, the lights of Pine Ridge faded into the storm as they rode into the wilderness. Elena could hear Brooks shouting orders to his remaining men, organizing a pursuit that would have to wait until morning. For now, they were safe. But as they rode deeper into the frozen wasteland, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. The real killer was still out there, and he wouldn't rest until she was silenced permanently. The noose might have missed her neck tonight, but death was still hunting her through the Wyoming snow. Jacob felt her shivering against him and urged his horse faster. There was an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles north, abandoned for years but still sturdy enough to provide shelter. If they could reach it before the storm got worse, they might have a chance to survive the night. As they rode through the howling darkness, neither of them spoke, but both were thinking the same thing. This was only the beginning of their fight for survival, and before it was over, the truth about Thomas Whitmore's murder would have to come to light. Otherwise, Elena would spend the rest of her life running from a lie, and Jacob would have sacrificed his peaceful solitude for nothing. The cabin appeared out of the blizzard like a gift from heaven, its dark windows and sagging roof barely visible through the driving snow. Jacob had to break down the door, which had been frozen shut for months, but inside they found blessed relief from the wind and cold. "There should be some old blankets in the back room," Jacob said, his breath visible in the frigid air, "and maybe some wood for the fireplace." Elena nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the full impact of what had happened was beginning to hit her. A few hours ago, she'd been caring for sick children on the Patterson ranch. Now she was a wanted fugitive, hiding in an abandoned cabin with a man she barely knew. "Thank you," she said quietly as Jacob began building a fire. "I don't know why you believed me when no one else would." Jacob paused in his work, staring into the growing flames. "I lost my wife and daughter 5 years ago," he said finally. "Cholera epidemic swept through the valley. Nothing I could do but watch them die." He looked up at her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "I know what real grief looks like, and what guilt looks like. You didn't have either when they dragged you to that gallows." Elena felt tears stinging her eyes. In all the chaos and fear, no one had bothered to really look at her, to see her innocence. "I was just trying to help, Mrs. Patterson's baby had a fever and I'd run out of willow bark extract. I knew Thomas Whitmore sometimes had medical supplies in his safe. So you went to see him that night?" "I knocked on his office door around 8 o'clock. When he didn't answer, I tried the handle. The door was unlocked." Elena's voice grew quiet as she relived that terrible moment. "I found him slumped over his desk, blood everywhere. I was checking for signs of life when Sheriff Brooks and his deputy burst in. Jacob stirred the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. Convenient timing. That's what I thought too, but who was I to accuse the law? Elena pulled one of the musty blankets around her shoulders. Brooks said it looked like I'd been going through Whitmore's papers, that I must have killed him when he caught me stealing. Were his papers disturbed? Yes, but not by me. Someone had ransacked his desk, pulled everything out of the drawers. But by the time I could explain that, half the town was calling for my blood. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the cabin's windows. Jacob checked his rifle and pistol, ensuring they were loaded and ready. They'll come after us in the morning. Brooks can't afford to let you live now, not after what I said about seeing him at the bank. Elena looked at him sharply. Did you really see him there? Jacob's smile was grim. No. But I've been watching that man for months, ever since cattle started disappearing from the smaller ranches. Good men have been losing their livelihoods, and somehow Brooks never seems to find the rustlers. You think he's involved? I think Thomas Whitmore figured something out and it got him killed. Jacob moved to the window, peering out into the storm. Question is, can we prove it before Brooks silences us both? Elena joined him at the window, her reflection ghostly in the frosted glass. What kind of proof would we need? Financial records, maybe. Bills of sale for stolen cattle. Something that shows money changing hands. Jacob turned away from the window. Whitmore was a careful man, kept detailed records of everything. If he discovered Brooks was taking bribes from rustlers, he'd have documented it. Those records could be anywhere. His office, his home, even a safe deposit box in another town. Or, Jacob said thoughtfully, with someone he trusted. Someone who could expose the truth if anything happened to him. They spent the next hour planning their next move while the storm raged outside. Elena proved to be more than just a frightened victim. Her quick mind and natural courage shone through as they discussed various strategies for clearing her name and exposing Brooks' corruption. There's something else, Jacob said as they settled down to try to get some sleep. Whitmore had a sister in Cheyenne, Martha Whitmore Graham. If he suspected he was in danger, he might have sent copies of his evidence to her. Elena's eyes brightened with hope for the first time since this nightmare began. How far is Cheyenne? 3 days hard ride in good weather. Maybe 5 or 6 in this storm. Jacob banked the fire, leaving just enough warmth to keep them from freezing. But it's our best shot. As they settled into their makeshift beds on opposite sides of the cabin, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the comfort of not being completely alone. Jacob Sterling might be a man of few words and many secrets, but he'd already proven he was willing to risk everything for justice. Jacob, she called softly through the darkness. Yeah? Why did you really help me tonight? The truth this time. There was a long silence, broken only by the wind outside. When Jacob finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because 5 years ago, when my family was dying, Thomas Whitmore was the only man in town willing to lend me money for medicine. He didn't have to do it, didn't even know me well, but he did it anyway. He paused. I owed him this much. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of shared grief and determination settling over both of them like another blanket. Tomorrow they would begin the most dangerous journey of their lives, racing through hostile territory to reach Cheyenne, before Brooks could track them down. But tonight, for the first time in days, she felt like she might actually survive to see justice done. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the little cabin, 2 unlikely allies prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Neither of them knew that in Cheyenne, Martha Whitmore Graham was already dead, killed by the same men who were now hunting them through the snow. The conspiracy ran deeper than they imagined, and before their journey was over, they would discover that Thomas Whitmore had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than simple cattle rustling. But that revelation lay ahead of them, hidden in the frozen miles between their refuge and the territorial capital. For now they had each other, their determination and the fading warmth of the fire to keep the darkness at bay. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm finally beginning to abate as pale sunlight filtered through the overcast sky. Jacob was already awake, checking their supplies and preparing his horse for the long journey ahead. Elena woke to the smell of coffee brewing over the rekindled fire. Drink this, Jacob said, handing her a steaming tin cup. It'll be the last hot meal we have for a while. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, its warmth spreading through her frozen bones. Any sign of pursuit? Jacob shook his head. Storm was too bad for them to follow last night, but they'll be coming now. We need to move fast. They broke camp quickly, leaving no trace of their presence behind. Jacob's stallion was strong and sure-footed, but carrying 2 riders through deep snow would slow them down considerably. Every minute counted now. As they rode out into the crystalline morning, Elena couldn't help but marvel at the stark beauty of the Wyoming wilderness. Snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly in every direction, and the silence was so complete it seemed almost sacred. It would have been peaceful if she wasn't running for her life. "Tell me about your family," Elena said as they navigated a treacherous ridge trail. She needed something to focus on besides the growing numbness in her fingers and toes. Jacob was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible over the crunch of snow beneath their horses' hooves. She was everything good in this world. Patient, kind, always seeing the best in people. And little Mary, she was only 3 when... He trailed off, unable to finish. "I'm sorry," Elena said softly. "I shouldn't have asked. No, it helps sometimes to remember them as they were, not just how they died." Jacob adjusted his grip on the reins. "Sarah would have liked you. She always said a person's character showed clearest when they were facing impossible odds." Elena felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Jacob's voice grew stronger, "which is why I know she'd want me to see this through. To make sure an innocent woman doesn't hang for something she didn't do." They rode in companionable silence for the next hour, each lost in their own thoughts. Elena found herself studying Jacob's profile, noting the way his jaw was set with determination, the careful way he scanned their surroundings for danger. He was handsome in a weathered, masculine way, but it was his quiet strength and moral compass that truly impressed her. "Riders," Jacob suddenly barked, pulling his horse behind a stand of pine trees. About 2 miles back, 4 or 5 of them. Elena's heart sank as she spotted the distant figures moving across the snow-covered valley below them. Even at this distance, she could make out the dark coat and broad silhouette of Sheriff Brooks leading the pursuit. "How did they find us so fast?" she whispered. Jacob's expression was grim. "They probably know this country as well as I do, maybe better." He studied the terrain ahead, calculating distances and options. "We can't outrun them carrying double, not in this snow." "Then leave me," Elena said without hesitation. "You've done enough. I won't have your death on my conscience, too." Jacob turned to stare at her, his blue eyes blazing. "That's not going to happen." He pointed toward a narrow canyon cutting through the mountains ahead of them. "Devil's Pass. It's dangerous, but it's our only chance. The trail's too narrow for them to surround us, and there are places we can make a stand if we have to." Elena nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Lead the way." Devil's Pass lived up to its name. The trail wound through towering rock walls that seemed to press in on them from both sides, blocking out most of the sunlight and creating an eerie, cathedral-like atmosphere. The path was treacherous, carved from solid rock and slick with ice, but Jacob navigated it with the skill of someone who'd spent years in these mountains. Halfway through the pass, Jacob suddenly held up his hand, bringing them to a halt. "Listen," he whispered. Elena strained her ears and heard it, the faint echo of hoofbeats behind them, growing closer by the minute. Their pursuers had entered the pass. "There!" Jacob pointed to a narrow ledge about 20 feet above the trail. "Can you climb?" Elena looked up at the sheer rock face and swallowed hard. "I'll have to." Jacob dismounted and helped her down, then began quickly unloading their supplies. "Take the rifle and all the ammunition you can carry. Get up there and find good cover. What about you? Someone needs to handle the horse, and I'm a better shot from down here." Jacob handed her his rifle and a leather pouch full of bullets. "Just remember, aim low. The cold affects bullet trajectory." Elena slung the rifle over her shoulder and began the treacherous climb. The rock was slippery with ice, and more than once she nearly lost her grip, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. When she finally pulled herself onto the ledge, she was breathing hard, but alive. Jacob had positioned his horse further up the trail and taken cover behind a large boulder. The hoofbeats were getting closer now, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. "Elena," Jacob called softly. "Whatever happens, don't let them take you alive. Brooks can't afford witnesses." Before she could respond, the first riders appeared around the bend in the trail. Sheriff Brooks rode in the lead, his face red with cold and fury. Behind him came Scar Murphy, his left arm in a makeshift sling but still carrying a rifle. 3 other men Elena didn't recognize brought up the rear, all of them armed and looking eager for violence. "Sterling?" Brooks's voice boomed through the canyon. "Give up the woman and we'll let you ride out of here." Jacob's reply was a rifle shot that sent Brooks' hat spinning into the snow. "Counteroffer, turn around and ride back to town and maybe I won't kill you all." The shooting started in earnest then, bullets ricocheting off the canyon walls with deadly whines. Elena forced herself to remain calm, picking her targets carefully and trying to make every shot count. From her elevated position, she had a clear view of the entire battle. One of Brooks's men tried to flank them by climbing the opposite wall of the canyon, but Elena's rifle spoke, and he tumbled back down with a cry of pain. Jacob was holding his position brilliantly, using the boulder for cover while picking off anyone who tried to advance up the trail. But they were outnumbered, and Brooks' men had more ammunition. Worse, Elena could see movement at the mouth of the canyon. More riders were arriving, cutting off their only escape route. "Jacob," she called out. "Behind you!" Jacob spun around just in time to see 2 more men entering the pass from the far end. They were trapped, caught between 2 groups of armed men in a narrow canyon with nowhere to run. "The cave!" Jacob suddenly shouted, pointing to a dark opening in the canyon wall about 50 yards ahead. "It goes all the way through the mountain." Elena had never heard of such a cave, but she trusted Jacob completely. She began providing covering fire as he ran for his horse, bullets chipping the rock all around him. Somehow he made it, swinging into the saddle and spurring the stallion toward the cave opening. Elena slid down from the ledge, scraping her hands and knees on the rough rock but managing to land on her feet. Jacob was already at the cave mouth, reaching down to pull her up behind him. "Are you sure about this?" she gasped as they plunged into the darkness. "No," Jacob admitted, "but it beats getting shot full of holes." The cave was pitch black and barely wide enough for the horse. Elena could hear the sound of dripping water and feel the oppressive weight of tons of rock above their heads. Behind them, she could hear Brooks shouting orders to his men, some of whom were apparently preparing to follow them into the mountain. "How do you know about this place?" Elena whispered. "Spent a lot of time exploring these mountains when I first came here. Sarah used to worry I'd get lost and never come home." Jacob's voice was tight with concentration as he guided the horse through the narrow passage. "This cave system connects 3 different valleys. If we can make it through, we'll come out about 10 miles from here." A gunshot echoed through the cave behind them, followed by shouting voices. Brooks' men were definitely following, but they were on foot, which gave Jacob and Elena a crucial advantage in speed. The passage seemed to go on forever, winding through the heart of the mountain like a giant serpent. Sometimes it opened into vast chambers where their horses' hooves echoed like thunder. Other times it narrowed so much that Jacob had to dismount and lead the stallion by the reins. "Light ahead," Elena whispered after what felt like hours in the darkness. Sure enough, a faint glow was visible in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. The cave mouth opened onto a steep hillside overlooking a valley Elena didn't recognize. Snow was falling again, which would help cover their tracks. "Where are we?" she asked as Jacob helped her dismount. "About 15 miles northeast of Pine Ridge. There's a relay station down in that valley, part of the territorial mail route." Jacob studied the sky, noting the position of the sun. "We can get fresh horses there, maybe even send a telegram to Cheyenne." Elena felt a flicker of hope. "Warning Martha Graham about what happened to her brother?" Jacob's expression darkened. "Among other things. Because I'm starting to think this conspiracy goes a lot deeper than cattle rustling." They began the descent into the valley, leading Jacob's tired horse carefully down the snowy slope. Behind them, Elena could hear faint voices echoing from the cave mouth. Brooks' men had made it through, but they were still on foot and hours behind. The relay station was a small, sturdy building with smoke rising from its chimney and several horses in the corral out back. As they approached, A grizzled old man emerged from the building, rifle in hand. "That's far enough, strangers," he called out. "State your business." Jacob held up his hands peacefully. "Name's Sterling. This is Elena Castillo. We need fresh horses and safe passage to Cheyenne." The old man squinted at them suspiciously. "Heard there was some trouble in Pine Ridge. Sheriff's looking for a murderer, they say." "The sheriff is the murderer," Elena said firmly. "I'm innocent, and we can prove it if we can reach Cheyenne alive." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because the old man lowered his rifle slightly. "Name's Jeremiah Cox. Been running this station for 20 years, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people." He studied Elena's face carefully. "You don't look like no killer to me." "Thank you," Elena breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Cox warned. "Brooks and his men came through here about 3 hours ago asking about you two. Left orders that anyone helping you would be considered accomplices to murder." Jacob's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "Are you planning to turn us in?" Cox spat in the snow. "Hell no. Never did trust that Brooks. Too slick if you ask me. A real lawman's got dirt under his fingernails and dust on his boots. Brooks always looks like he just stepped out of a barber shop." Elena almost smiled despite their desperate situation. "Can you help us?" "Maybe. Depends on what you're really up to." Cox gestured toward the station house. "Come inside, get warm, and tell me the whole story. If I believe you, I'll see what I can do." They spent the next hour telling Cox everything that had happened, from Thomas Whitmore's murder to their harrowing escape through Devil's Pass. The old station master listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or grunting in response to particularly telling details. "Whitmore was a good man," Cox said finally. "Helped me out of a financial jam a few years back when the territorial government was late paying for mail services. If Brooks killed him, then by God we need to see justice done. Then you'll help us." Cox stood up and moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. "I'll do better than that. I'll give you the fastest horses I've got and enough supplies to reach Cheyenne in 2 days." He pulled out a telegraph key and began setting it up. "Plus, I'll send a message ahead, warning Martha Graham that you're coming." Elena watched hopefully as Cox began tapping out his message. But after a few minutes, his expression grew troubled. "That's odd," he muttered. Getting no response from Cheyenne, Jacob leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "Could be weather interfering with the lines. Could be equipment problems." Cox's voice was grim. "Or could be something worse." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You think something's happened to Martha Graham?" "I think," Cox said slowly, "that you folks might be walking into a trap. If Brooks is part of something bigger, they might have people in Cheyenne too." Jacob stood up abruptly. "Then we need to change our plans." "No," Elena said firmly. "Martha Graham is our only hope of proving the truth. If she's in danger, then we need to help her." Cox looked at her with newfound respect. "That's a brave thing to say, miss. Also possibly the stupidest thing I've heard all day. Maybe. But I won't spend the rest of my life running from a lie." Elena met Jacob's eyes. "I'm going to Cheyenne. With or without help." Jacob studied her face for a long moment, seeing the same determination that had attracted him to Sarah all those years ago. "Then I guess we're going to Cheyenne." Cox shook his head but began gathering supplies. "If you're set on this fool's errand, at least do it right. Take the mountain trail instead of the main road. It's longer, but less likely to have Brooks' men watching it." As they prepared to leave, Cox pulled Jacob aside. "There's something else you should know. About 6 months ago, a federal marshal came through here asking questions about cattle rustling in this territory. Name was Sam Parker. Haven't seen him since. You think he's dead?" "I think a lot of people who've gotten too close to this thing have ended up dead." Cox handed Jacob a rifle and a box of ammunition. "Watch yourselves out there, and if you do make it to Cheyenne, look up a woman named Kate Sullivan. She runs a boarding house on 3rd Street. Tell her Jeremiah Cox sent you and she'll help however she can." Elena felt tears in her eyes as she hugged the old man goodbye. In a world where it seemed like everyone was against her, it meant everything to find people willing to risk their own safety to help a stranger. The fresh horses Cox provided were strong and well-rested, able to make good time despite the snow and difficult terrain. As they rode away from the relay station, Elena looked back to see smoke still rising from the chimney, a beacon of warmth and hope in the frozen wilderness. "Thank you," she called back to Cox, who was standing in his doorway watching them leave. The old man touched his hat brim in farewell. "Just make sure it counts, miss. Make sure it counts." As they disappeared into the snowy forest, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding toward either salvation or certain death. There was no middle ground left now, no safe haven where they could hide and wait for the storm to pass. They had to reach Cheyenne, find Martha Graham, and expose the truth, or die trying. Behind them, Sheriff Brooks and his men were still coming, their pursuit relentless and deadly. Ahead lay the territorial capital, where answers waited, along with unknown dangers that might be even worse than the ones they were fleeing. But Elena Castillo had made her choice. She would not live as a fugitive, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid. She would fight for her freedom and her life no matter what the cost. And beside her, Jacob Sterling rode with grim determination, driven by his own demons and his promise to see justice done. Together, they faced the frozen miles ahead, two unlikely allies bound by circumstance and a growing respect that was beginning to bloom into something deeper. The mountain trail to Cheyenne stretched out before them, treacherous and unforgiving. But they would travel it together, and whatever waited at the end of their journey, they would face it side by side. Night was falling as they crested a ridge and saw the lights of Cheyenne twinkling in the valley below like fallen stars. The territorial capital looked peaceful and welcoming from a distance, but Elena knew that appearances could be deceiving. Somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings, the truth about Thomas Whitmore's murder was waiting to be uncovered. They found Kate Sullivan's boarding house on 3rd Street just as Cox had promised. The elderly woman took one look at their frost-covered faces and ushered them inside without question, her maternal instincts overriding any concerns about harboring fugitives. "Jeremiah Cox sent us," Jacob said simply. And that was enough. Kate led them to a back room where they could warm themselves by the fire. "Martha Graham's been dead for 3 days," she said without preamble. "Found shot in her home, same as her brother. But before she died, she gave me something to hold for safekeeping." Elena's heart sank, but Kate continued. "Martha was smart. She knew they'd come for her eventually. So she made copies of everything Thomas had sent her." The old woman produced a leather satchel from beneath a loose floorboard. Bank records, bills of sale, correspondence between Sheriff Brooks and a cattle baron named Harrison Steele. Enough evidence to hang them all. Jacob examined the documents by lamplight, his face growing grimmer with each page. "This goes all the way to the territorial governor's office. They've been stealing cattle, selling them across state lines, and splitting the profits 3 ways. Thomas figured it out when he noticed irregular deposits in Brooks' account," Kate explained. "That's what got him killed." Elena felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. The truth was finally in their hands, but it had cost so many lives. "What do we do now?" "There's a federal marshal staying at the Grand Hotel," Kate said. "Real one this time, sent from Washington to investigate the disappearance of Marshal Parker. His name is Daniel Morrison, and he's been asking questions about corruption in local law enforcement." The next morning, Elena and Jacob met with Marshal Morrison in his hotel room. The federal lawman listened intently as they told their story and presented Martha Graham's evidence. His expression grew darker with each revelation. "This explains a lot," Morrison said finally. "We've been tracking this conspiracy for months, but we needed proof. What you've brought me is enough to bring down the entire network." Within hours, federal agents were moving through Cheyenne making arrests. Sheriff Brooks was taken into custody as he tried to flee town, along with Harrison Steele and 3 territorial officials. The corruption ran deep, but the evidence was overwhelming. At her trial, Elena was completely exonerated. The real story of Thomas Whitmore's murder came to light, and she was hailed as a hero for exposing the conspiracy despite the terrible personal cost. "What will you do now?" Jacob asked as they stood on the courthouse steps, free at last. Elena looked at him, this quiet man who had risked everything to save her life. "I was thinking about settling down somewhere, maybe starting a real medical practice instead of just traveling from place to place." Jacob's weathered face broke into a rare smile. "I know a place. Good land, clean water, room for a doctor and maybe a family someday." Elena took his offered arm. feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. The promise of a real home, with someone who understood her strength and valued her courage. As they walked away from the courthouse together, snow began to fall again, but this time it felt like a blessing instead of a curse. The harsh Wyoming winter that had nearly killed them had also forged an unbreakable bond between two survivors who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances. Sheriff Brooks would hang for his crimes, Harrison Steele would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and the territorial corruption that had cost so many lives was finally exposed. Justice had been served, but more importantly, two lonely people had found each other in the frozen wilderness and discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come not from surviving the storm, but from learning to trust someone enough to weather it together. The noose that had tightened around Elena's neck that terrible night in Pine Ridge had been cut by more than just Jacob's knife. It had been severed by courage, determination, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to surrender in the face of impossible odds. In the end, love had proven stronger than corruption, truth more powerful than lies, and hope more enduring than the harshest winter the American frontier had ever seen.